Immigrants from China, what was a piece of media you didn't know was censored until you left China? While this doesn't completely fall under censorship, I didn't know about the Great Leap Forward until I was a young adult. Folks in my parents' and grandparents' generations would talk about the Cultural Revolution, but no one spoke of the Great Leap Forward. My personal theory is that it was such a disaster for government planning that everyone bought into. There is a sense of loss of face, so no one wants to bring it up. Not sure what light it's painted in Chinese textbooks, as I left the country as I was entering grad school. I went to the National Museum of China in Beijing. It has a few rooms of China's history in a timeline set up. I studied Chinese history for a semester at uni, so I had knowledge of what occurred during Mao Zedong's rule. They completely omitted 20 or so years of this history. It blew my mind that they essentially deleted a chunk of bad history and only kept the good stuff. My parents are from China, who are not Chinese. Mum told us that when the Korean Wars were happening, the CCP made her family donate their riches to help the cause in North Korea. It wasn't until they left China that they found out what a shithole North Korea was. There's not a lot here, so I'll write what I've experienced in China about Taiwan. At first they insisted it was entirely part of the PROC. Then when I asked about if they can go to visit, it was described as a place full of rebels with guns who'd shoot at them if they tried. This was in Fuzhou, which is only about 100 kilometers from Taiwan and whose outlying town had a ferry to the country. So I was shocked they thought that, especially considering I just got back from taking that ferry and had a lovely time in Matsu. Passport control sure, but no one shooting us or any of the ABCs, American-born Chinese, that were doing a visa run. I've posted about this before. I literally had no idea about Tiananmen Square massacre until I got here. Most people older than me saw the protests in the streets, but I never heard anyone talking about it, ever. I'm a second-gen immigrant but went back and grew up in China since very young. I never learned about this until when I went to study abroad. It's pretty shocking that this was never brought up during my entire childhood amongst my family either. I brought it up with my parents recently. Turns out my dad even protested during then. Crazy just how much this event became completely silenced. Moved to the States at 6 years old. Learned about Tiananmen and the US. Visited Beijing with family at 13ish. We visited Tiananmen Square. I asked my mom in public, "Hey, wasn't this where the Tiananmen Square massacre happened?" My mom got scared and told me to never talk about this in public. Apparently there are undercover officers that walk around and would arrest us if they hear people talking about things like this. Didn't understand back then. I do now. When I was on a high school trip like 5 years ago, we had a tour guide, such a nice and funny dude, who sat with a few of my friends while we were on our way back from a long day at a zoo or something. Everyone in the bus was half asleep, but we were chatting him up, intrigued by everything we were learning. At one point he mentioned the Tiananmen massacre, and talked about it with such sadness in his voice. He said he was a student while it was happening, and he protested along with the rest of his classmates. But then they heard sirens and gunshots, and then he said he just ran. He didn't stay there long enough to witness much, but on his way out of the square he said he saw one of his classmates get run over by a tank that was headed straight for the square. He asked us to not mention anything about this story while we were still on that trip. It was so sad to see him afraid to speak about it. Obligatory, not an immigrant, but I'm first generation born in Australia. All my relatives live in China, Hong Kong. I've never visited Hong Kong though, and often visit Shanghai to see my grandpa and uncle. Last time I went, I tried everything and it didn't work. Here's my list. Google. Surprisingly, Google Translate worked though. I had the app. YouTube, Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, Facebook, Snapchat, Discord. I think Skype didn't work either. On WhatsApp a lot of functions didn't work. I could send messages but nothing else. Reddit, Netflix, and there's a few others I think I just didn't visit in the span of time I was there. So yeah, incredibly irritating. And the news is heavily modified to fit a picturesque view of China that makes it seem great. And annoyingly my parents are on China's side with the Hong Kong protests at the moment, whilst I oppose it heavily. So much is censored there, it's insane. WeChat is such a huge app over there entirely for the reason it's one of the few that are available. Heard from someone else that Amazon doesn't work either. Born and raised in a large city in China, immigrated here when I was 18 in 2007. I already knew about Tiananmen massacre, as my mom's cousins were among the students and my mom's ex-BF were among the soldiers when they were all young. I already heard about the organ harvesting story on the cult members, but it was some regional crap that's not the norm. I knew people who had insights about the living condition in the re-educational camp where they hold the cult members in my city. At least it wasn't too bad in my city. It sounded like somewhere between a prison and a summer camp. I already knew people in HK hated China, only because I watched Japanese TV while I was traveling in Japan with my parents. Summer 1997 when the CCP got HK back to China from UK. I already knew the CCP army surrenders in Korean War had the choice to be released to Taiwan and many of them chose so. Only because my grandfather went and fought in combats during the entire war. I was a teenager who was a rebel and felt oppressed, so I did my fair part of research. Plus I had the advantage of knowing people who participated such historical events in person. But I doubt the majorities of Chinese would care to learn as much as I did. Sometimes being ignorant and dumb is a blessing if you are stuck in a situation you can't change. What I did not know was how CCP did little to nothing during the World War II in order to preserve power, while the Nationalist Party gave everything to defend the country. Later CCP won the Civil War by brainwashing the uneducated majorities, then twisted the whole story totally to the opposite in history textbooks and forced generations of people to believe the CCP was the legitimate ruler. The CCP even promoted for the idea of having multiple political parties to avoid tyranny and corruption, up until they took over China and took a huge turn. Obligatory not Chinese, but I lived in China for 3 years. I had Chinese HBO and was really happy to see many of my favorite movies come on when I was couch surfing. But half the time I'd watch them and, like, a day or two later I would be lying in bed trying to go to sleep and I'd remember a scene from that movie that didn't appear in the Chinese version. Apocalypto, much omitted. Ron Burgundy, much omitted. Thrones, much omitted. I wish I could remember which movie it was, but in one case an entire subplot was excised from the film. I got really angry about it. It pisses me off on an artistic level. I can't believe HBO and those who license their films to them let them compromise and devalue their art like that. Yeah, I have a friend who gets movies from shady locations. Borrowed 50 Shades of Grey from him, which he got for his girlfriend. The movie had Korean subtitles. It came from Korea where pee is illegal, so the entire movie was like 17 minutes after they cut out all the sex scenes. Not a Chinese immigrant, but my roommate was. I brought up Mao in a conversation once and started talking about the Culture Revolution. He interrupted me and said, "That wasn't Mao." I paused for a second and told him it most certainly was Mao. And he replies, "No, Mao was sick while all that was happening. He didn't have anything to do with it." I ended up having to show him multiple sources to convince him Mao orchestrated it. When I finally convinced him he just said oh and shrugged his shoulders. When I finally convinced him, you wish. Chinese immigrant here. I moved to Canada starting at grade 3, so I guess there wasn't much to know to begin with. I learned about Tiananmen Square, Mao's escapades, etc. And when I went back to tell my friend about it, they revealed to me that they and almost every kid in China knows about it, but it doesn't do them very well to show it. As kids we weren't pumped with a lot of propaganda. It was a lot of love your family and be kind to elders. Your typical moral compass that I would get during my schooling in China. We gather at the field every Monday to watch the flag raise and sing the anthem and do some morning exercises. Eye exercises, and we clean, sweep and wipe our classrooms before we can leave school. We would wear red ties around our necks, and that was about as close to communistic practices as it got. After coming here, it's weird seeing how Westerners and their media viewed communism. It wasn't a big deal in my life to begin with, and everyone that I know in China are leading lives that aren't terribly different than others in Western countries. For years I struggled to see how my life would be different either way. I got mad at people calling Chinese people commies, or even my HK and Taiwan classmates calling me a peasant and a lowlife. It made me believe that people were fear-mongered and delusional because I've only know people from all over China who are kind, considerate, generous and extremely hardworking to the point where they don't have time to be involved in doing stupid crap. However, I only started to feel weird about my home country when I went back last time. RE face cameras meant the streets are very safe, but I couldn't access many things without a Chinese number which required a Chinese ID. They got rid of a bunch of Visa terminals, so people like me are forced to use WeChat Pay, which I can't use now, and people in general feel way more on edge than ever before. Questions that I would have and be curious about and they can't answer. Before, I remember there being so many Visa terminals and it was easy for foreigners to spend money and have fun in China without worrying about anything. Chinese people can talk smack about the government regulations in public. But now I can't help but feel that China moved away from catering to the international people to now turning another cheek for some reason I can't work out. I feel something's going down and I just don't want the Chinese people to be paying the big price for it in the end. Not a lot of true immigrants in this post, but I am a genuine immigrant. First time answering Ask Reddit. I'm pretty excited. Hopefully my answer will not get buried in the comments. When I left China in the early 2000s, there weren't much censorship on the internet, honestly. It is because the internet is still young and the CCP probe hasn't caught up with it yet. Most of the censorship is what is on the TV. The Tank Man video is censored. I first saw the video for the first time in 7th grade in America. Although it was my first time seeing the video, I immediately know what it is about because I vividly remember my family or people I knew talked about it. There wasn't a lot of hate when they were discussing it, maybe because they didn't protest and were nowhere near BJ. Mao was always praised as the greatest leader blah blah blah, and the horrible things he has done weren't taught in the book. Though, I have seen some small-time Chinese TV shows out euphemistically criticizing what he has done. Their version of the Pledge of Allegiance says to love the party, love the country, love the people. Notice how they say love the party first, lol. I didn't question it when I was a kid why they put the love the party first, or even put it in there at all. Frick the party. Honestly, the best part of being the immigrant who speaks both languages is that it allows me to get both sides of view and allow me to hear both sides of the story. It allows me to be more unbiased. We love to say that in the US nothing is censored. Freedom of Speech Act. Although things are not censored, the news are very biased. Look at Fox News. It can create such a large information gap between Americans. Dem versus Rep. Imagine what kind of gap it can create between people from two different countries. Things aren't censored in America, sure, but things aren't mentioned either. If things aren't mentioned, then people don't even know they exist. It is sort of like softcore censorship we have it here. The politicians do it very smartly. Sadly, once people fell in this information gap trap, it's so hard for them to get out. Look at our Ferdinand and our Sino. They are the perfect example of it. Also, people from both sides are fed with a heavy dose of patriotism when they were growing up. Same trick, same crap, different country. I sincerely hope people can actually open their eyes to realize the same trick, same crap but different country part. Some people just can't accept their country isn't flawless. There is a running joke that when Chinese students study abroad, they complain everyone else knows more about China than me. My wife, who is from China, came to the US in 2003. A Taiwanese classmate of hers asked her why the Chinese government could be so cruel during the Tiananmen Square protests. My wife argued with him and called him a liar, until she found the videos of the protests on YouTube. I still make fun of her sometimes for this. Yikes, I did the same, arguing with a Taiwanese person about it until I realized I was wrong. I live in India, but I study in the UK, so I have a lot of Chinese friends who I live with. What surprised me the most is how they talked about Tibet. They talk as if it's such a nice place to visit, a great tourist destination with people who love China. It just really shook me because I have been to Tibetan refugee markets. I have seen the squalor a lot of them live in India. I've seen so much Tibetan sadness that I couldn't make sense of how they could say that Tibet was the prettiest place in China. In my head, Tibet is not China. Tibet is a war-torn place with its people displaced. I actually knew about a lot of stuff before I traveled to Australia, since there was a period before 2008 when everything was accessible, like YouTube and Twitter and stuff. I remember I was crushed watching the Tiananmen Square massacre documentary. It was an earth-shattering type thing, like finding out about a much uglier alternative reality that I actually live in. but I never knew if the organ harvesting thing is legit or not, and I never bothered to check simply because finding out doesn't change anything really. Every time I come back to China it's frustrating as heck, but you get used to it since there are Chinese equivalents of everything. Immigrated to Canada when in high school. In social class there are 4 pages in the textbook dedicated to China, with one of them focused on Tiananmen incident. Went home and asked my dad about it. He was surprised I never heard about it somehow back in China, lol. Apparently his friend was at the protests and said the situation is not as bad as how the media would have you believe. This is one of the reasons I remain skeptical on what really happened that day. Also was surprised to learn that communism is considered a bad ideology and comparable to fascism in certain context. And soon found out China is communism in name only, with a bit more research. Apparently Henry Norman Bethune was almost a nobody here but was revered greatly in China. Also learnt about how the issue of gun control gathered sizable supporters on each side. Being from China, gun ownership is a no-no and I can see why the government wants to keep it that way. There are music videos that can be practically considered softcore P in China, plays on public TV channels at prime time. LGBTQ rights almost never hit mainstream media in China. I was under the impression that it is much less common than it actually is. Dalai Lama is well respected by a lot of PPL. In China he is almost unanimously considered a traitor. I read your list. I am sad though that you still remain skeptical about Tiananmen Square, though. I was born and raised in the UAE, but went back to China every year steadily when I was a child for months at a time. I didn't even know gay people existed in any capacity until I had immigrated to Canada and somehow learned about it in around age 12. It's one thing to be homophobic ignorant. I think it's another thing to be completely unaware that this sort of thing could exist. I literally did not think about being gay people because the idea that you could be anything other than straight had never existed for me. Never did for me either in Sweden. Don't think you do as a kid unless someone near is gay. And certainly not pre-internet. Today it's probably very different. Not China, but one time I was on a flight. I think it was Qatar Airways or one of the other Middle Eastern ones. It was a long flight so I settled down to watch it. Do you guys remember the scene where the Jewish kid is practicing for his bar mitzvah? Entirely cut from the film. Any mention of that kid's Jewishness? Cut. Half of the gory scenes in the movie? Cut. Really surreal experience. Immigrant here. Not everyone likes China and Western social media and games. That's about it though. My dad actually told me about Tiananmen Square. And hey, we're alive. But I was not too surprised by it. Was 10 at the time. My parents immigrated from China back in the 1990s. I went to school for 5 years in Shanghai and have gone back there every summer. I straight up never knew that Tibet was a place that the rest of the world recognized. I learned about it in middle school here and was so confused because I had just known the region by a different name and thought the place was always just integrated into China. I had never heard about Tiananmen Square until I came to the US. I did know though that the censors on the internet back in China would be extremely active on the 4th of June. Any mention of the date or related words would be censored on the online forums I used. Tiba was the main one, which it hadn't even come out back then. And while I knew back then that posts relating to the date were being deleted and censored, I never knew why until I learned about it in high school. It wasn't until recently that my grandma told me about the Cultural Revolution and how I have a distant relative that fled to Taiwan when the PRC was formed. She told me it was a family secret and a shame. My worldview changed a lot since I moved away from China and became more integrated in American society. I definitely was fed a lot of propaganda as a kid and was an avid defender of China and its ideals. When your formative years are spent there and all the media you consume is so strictly regulated and curated, of course you never learn to question it. Me. Indian parents. My friends. White guy. A Hong Kong exchange student and a Taiwanese kid. Had to explain the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests in high school. 1997. Chinese kid did not believe us. Goes home and asks his mother about it. She explains that the incidents in 1986 led to her leaving and sponsoring him, and so that he arrived in Canada in 1990. His mind was blown and showed his teenage rebellion as denouncing everything Chinese. Not censorship, but how Putin and Russia are viewed as evil by the Western media. In China, Putin is seen as a strong and capable leader, and Russia is just another country with more historically shared ideological roots, yet communism, socialism. Oh boy, how Soviet Russia is not a positively viewed era in Eastern Europe. Fun fact, Estonian GDP fell back about 10 years after Soviets took over, and that's before the Eastern Front got reopened. Not an immigrant but spent time in China. I was there in '08 when a massive 8+ mag earthquake rocked everything near Chengdu and was felt from Shanghai to Beijing. I was in a shiplock when it hit and our crap was rocking all over the place. It was wild. Over 80,000 people died. We couldn't get on the internet or make international phone calls for nearly 4 days. They jammed everything. None of my emails to my parents went through to tell them I was okay. All my friends' phones that were unlocked for international just went dead when you tried to call anything. The internet was basically cut off everywhere we went. We eventually found an American businessman at a bar with a sat phone that could get through, and he agreed to let us use the phone to call our loved ones as long as we got him a few drinks. He was chill as frick. He was on the phone with his wife and then with his company when we approached him and begged to use his phone so we could call our people and let them know we were okay. China is an amazingly beautiful place, with great people, food, and culture, but their approach to censorship and speech is completely fricked. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.